said hello, I guess we can get started. I don't think there's anybody here to introduce me, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Patricia Boland. I'm visiting here from the beautiful state of Texas. I am an amateur researcher with the emphasis on the word amateur. I'm not connected with law enforcement. I'm just someone who fell headfirst into what we call the Cooper vortex, which means once you get sucked in, you can't get out. So this is a public service announcement. You still have time to leave. All right, so that being said, why are we here today? To look at the only unsolved hijacking of a jet airliner in the United States. There was only one. Let's go back in time. I see there's a lot of young people here. What was airplane travel like in the 1960s and early 70s? Okay. You showed up at the airport, you paid your money, and you got on the plane. There were no metal detectors, you didn't have to go like this, you didn't have to put your stuff, you didn't have to take out your liquid. They didn't ask for any identification, they just asked your name and you wrote it on the ticket and you were good to go. Which is kind of ironic because of what was going on at that time. How many people remember how many planes were being hijacked in the 1960s and 70s, right? And where were most of them being hijacked to? Anybody remember? Cuba, that's right. There were a lot of young, kind of pseudo-revolutionary types. Of course, they had no trouble getting a gun on an airplane, so they would get on the plane and put the gun to somebody's head and say, take me to Cuba. Well, this almost became like a late-night joke on Johnny Carson, right? In fact, my understanding is that some of the stewardesses, and I call them stewardesses because that's what they were called back then, would actually pack a swimsuit just in case. In fact, the FBI became so exasperated that they considered building a fake Havana airport in Florida. So that when the planes were hijacked, they would land in Florida. Of course, the hijackers would see the big sign, welcome to Havana. Of course, when they landed, oops, the FBI would be waiting for them. So this is how crazy this time period was. The U.S. government was not really on board with doing some extra precautions or safety measures, although they did have air marshals that they would periodically put on planes. But the ironic part is the airlines did not want to increase security because they did not want to disturb their passengers in any way, which seems quite ironic to us today. So anyway, who are we here to talk about on this beautiful day? On 11/24/71, which was the day before Thanksgiving, which is kind of interesting, a middle-aged man. Again, what did people used to wear to fly on planes? They used to dress up, right? They didn't wear pajamas like they do now. So this man shows up at the Portland, Oregon airport. He's wearing a business suit and a tie and a raincoat, and he's carrying a briefcase. And he walks up to the ticket agent and he says, "Can I get on your flight from Portland to Seattle? This is just a short flight, 30 minutes. So the ticket agent said, "What's your name, sir?" And believe it or not, he said, "Cooper, Dan Cooper." Well, how did he become D.D. Cooper? Well, when the story broke, one of the reporters thought he overheard somebody say something and got printed in the paper. In fact, Walter Cronkite that night on the news actually called him Master Criminal D.A. Cooper. So we don't even, right from the beginning, this whole case was really kind of a mess. So anyway, he paid his $20, he got his ticket. Now, some things never changed. The Portland, Oregon airport was under construction. So instead of entering the plane from the jetway like you normally would, actually you had to make passengers go outside and enter the plane from the stairs, from the tarmac. Now, I know I have a lot of pilots in the room. What was different? This is the actual plane, Northwest Flight 305. What was different about the 727 as opposed to other planes that were flying at that time? Well, there were only 2 in the United States that were flying that actually had stairs in the back of the plane. Now, of course, this becomes critical to the entire case, and we have to think that D.B. Cooper, whoever he was, knew that this plane had stairs in the back, right? Okay, so what exactly happened? So Cooper gets on the plane, he sits in the back row, orders a bourbon and 7-Up. Have you ever had a bourbon and 7-Up if you're over 21 or not? And promptly spills it. Strange. Well, the stewardesses take their seats, and Cooper turns around and hands one of them a note. There were 6 crew members on board. There were 3 men in the cockpit, and there were 3 very young ladies who were the stewardesses, all under the age of 25. So he turns around and hands her a note. Well, she thought it was a guy trying to slip her his phone number. So she stuck it in her pocket and said, "Miss, you better read that note." And when she did, it said, "Miss, I have a bomb. Come sit by me." So she did. Meanwhile, the plane is just taxiing on the runway. And of course, they take off before she can really alert anyone. Well, Cooper is sitting in the middle seat, and next to him is a briefcase, which he opens up. It looked like a bomb. There were about 8 sticks. Were they dynamite? Were they something else? We don't know. There was what appeared to be a D-cell battery and a bunch of wires. And he told her if they put the 2 wires together, that was going to be the end of the plane. Okay. So obviously they all took this extremely serious. Of course, this is the guy. This sketch was done based on the stewardesses. What they say he looked like, kind of an odd-looking fellow, I think. Strangely enough, they revised this sketch about a year later, which to me don't even look like the same men. So that caused a lot of false people being accused or turned in or whatever. So anyway, Cooper, he had some demands. This is what Cooper demanded. He told the stewardess to start writing, and this is what he demanded. Okay, he wanted $200,000 in a knapsack, 4 parachutes, which are actually 2 sets of shoes. Are any skydivers in the room? Anybody ever jumped out of an airplane? Well, you have a front chute and you have a back chute. All right, the back chute is the main chute that everybody's familiar with. The front chute is attached. It's in case the back chute doesn't work. It's called a reserve. So the fact he asked for 2 sets of chutes got everybody thinking, uh-oh, he's going to take a hostage with him. All right. He also asked for some very odd flight configurations. He wanted the plane to fly with the flaps at 15 degrees, cabin lights out, the back stairs down when they take off, depressurized, fly below 10,000 feet, do not refuel into Mexico, which is where he said he wanted to go, no Cuba for D.B. Cooper. He said, keep the landing gear down the entire flight and open the rear bulkhead door. Okay. Well, the pilots radioed down to Northwest Airlines, and they said there is absolutely no way we can take off with the stairs down. They're going to be damaged on takeoff, and this is not happening. So Cooper said, okay, that's fine. How about we open them in the air? They said, what? So they didn't even know. They actually had to call Boeing to find out if this was possible. And Boeing said, yes, you can lower, don't try this at home, but yes, you can lower the stairs in flight. Okay. So be thinking about how did Cooper know all this stuff? Okay. So, they had to gather the money, $200,000. Coincidentally, was sitting in a vault at Seafirst Bank, which was a huge Seattle area bank with multiple branches. So they had $200,000, and importantly, the serial numbers were already recorded. So they brought the money, they finally landed in Seattle. They'd been circling for about 2.5 hours trying to get all this stuff together. They gave us, the pilot gave, the passengers a story that they had to burn off fuel, it was all made up, of course. Again, in Cooper's favor, none of the passengers ever knew they were being hijacked. So nobody had any reason to be noticing this guy. The cockpit crew never saw Cooper. So the only really good witnesses are 3 young ladies under the age of 25 who are scared to death, obviously. Okay, so they bring the money to the plane once it lands, but guess what? They didn't put it in a knapsack. They put it in what we call the Looney Tunes bag. Remember the old cartoons? There would be a money bag with a big dollar sign. Well, that's kind of what it looked like. It said Seafirst, but it was this really flimsy looking bag with $200,000 in $20 bills stuffed in it. That's 22 pounds of $20 bills. So he's like, what am I going to do with this? Well, anyway, he lets the passengers go because he's got his money. So now they bring, the stewardess goes out again, brings the parachutes on, and the parachutes were not what he requested. Oddly enough, they couldn't find any parachutes. The McCord Air Force Base is really close by, but for whatever reason, was it chain of command? Was it the night before Thanksgiving? They couldn't find any shoes. So somebody knew somebody who was a stunt pilot, and he sent over his 2 back parachutes in a taxi cab. Then they sent someone, a police officer, over to Issaquah, Washington, which is not far, to a skydiving school to get the 2 front chutes. Again, oddly, one of them was a training chute and it wasn't even operational. It was one of those things like you pull it and stuff pops out. So, everything, nothing in this case makes sense if you're already figuring that. Okay. So, the other problem we have is based on these configurations. You can't get to Mexico on 1 tank of fuel when you are flying low and slow, with the landing gear down, the flaps at 15. There's no way they were going to make it to Mexico. So they did a little negotiating. Again, all this is going, the stewardess is having to go up to the front and talk to the cockpit, and they fall down in. So this is like almost a game of telephone here. So they finally decided that Reno was the place that they were going to stop and refuel. Okay, so Cooper had a problem in that he didn't know how he was going to attach the money to himself because he didn't have an knapsack. So he decides, since he could not use the 2 reserve chutes, because guess what? The back chutes did not have the proper apparatus to connect the front. So, okay, he's getting really annoyed now. So he decides to cut up the paracord from one of the parachutes that he wasn't going to use, which paracord is very strong. He had a knife with him. It's the cords that would attach the canopy to the backpack. And he methodically cut about 80 feet of paracord and proceeded to wrap the money around himself. Okay. So at this point, it's getting close to 8 o'clock, right? It's dark. I mean, it's Seattle. It's been dark for quite a while. So Cooper said, okay, kind of time for me to go. I'm going to open the back stairs. Well, he couldn't get the door open for some reason. Now think about it. If Cooper could not have opened that back door, he was in a gigantic silvery jail cell, right? I mean, he was trapped. So they slowed the plane down a bit, the stewardess helped him, and he got the stairs down. sent her up front, and this is where the case completely falls apart. And in my opinion, is why it's probably never been solved. Around 8 o'clock, or was it 8:10, or was it 8:15? The pilots saw some movement on their gauges, oscillating. What's going on here? And then a couple minutes later, they had a weird popping sound in their ears. Well, they weren't quite sure what to make of that, but they continued on their journey. They finally landed in Reno about 11 o'clock. Well, of course, the minute they landed, all 4 of them left on the plane, ran to the back. And guess what's missing? The hijacker, the money, the briefcase, of course, the back parachute he used, and the dummy chute, the training chute, is also missing, and we don't know why. Nothing. The only thing that remained of D.B. Cooper were 7 cigarette butts that he smoked, Raleigh filter tips, and a cheap JCPenney clip-on tie with a cheap tie clip. It was almost like a thumb in their eye. That's all that's left of me is this tie that cost $1.25. Okay. So now for my parachute people, this actually is the back chute that he did not use, of course. We don't know where the one he used is. It is at the Washington State History Museum in Tacoma. It is not on display normally. It was for a little while, but they keep that thing under lock and key, and I know that personally because I have tried to get access to it. And it's in a vault, and they're not letting anybody near it. So what does the FBI do now, right? The FBI at the time consisted of a lot of accountants and attorneys. What did they know about skydiving? They thought, this is the craziest thing we've ever heard. Some guy's jumping out of an airplane, for sure he's dead. We're going to go, we're going to find him, we're going to send him off to the coroner, and we're going to go have an attorney dinner. So they waited about 72 hours before they did any kind of boots on the ground looking for Cooper, believe it or not. Except everybody who lived in northern Washington was out looking for Cooper and $200,000. This was a huge news story. But you have to remember, at this point in time in 1971, Seattle was in a major economic depression. The federal government had canceled Boeing's SST contract, and they had laid off a ton of people. There were billboards that said, well, the last person out of Seattle, please turn out the lights. So this was, a lot of people were really rooting for Cooper. They thought, you know what, this guy got away with it. Nobody got hurt. The plane was barely damaged. The insurance money paid out for the ransom. So, this guy became a folk hero, as evidenced by the fact that we have a gentleman right here who's wearing one of his t-shirts, right? So he still is considered, a lot of people think he's like a super cool guy. I personally think he's a criminal, but you can think whatever you want, right? So now the manhunt begins. Okay, if women decided, oops, I don't think we're going to find him that easily. So they start looking at Air Force people. They're looking at smoke jumpers. That was a big group of people up and down the West Coast that fight fires. They were looking at skydiving clubs. And Cooper was described as being a little bit darker skinned. Swarthy was the word they used. So they were zeroing on clubs maybe that were ethnic. In other words, maybe Mexican-American skydivers or Native American skydivers. Well, anyway, they did not find anything. They went through piles and thousands of cards and parachutists who had jumped in the air. They found nothing. Of course, everybody and their brothers started turning in people. It's my brother-in-law, the one who's mean to my sister. I know it was him. And based on the photo I showed you, they were turning in a lot of the younger guys because the switch kind of resembles. So a lot of 20-somethings were getting turned in. Meanwhile, the FBI profile said that they thought he was about 48. So there was so much misdirection. They investigated over 1,000 men. There are still about 5 men, of course they're all deceased, whose files have never been closed by the FBI. Everyone else has been eliminated, but there are 5 guys that are still, they're probably not Cooper, but they never felt comfortable closing it. In fact, every year there used to be a big celebration in Ariel, Washington, which is in more northern Washington, where they would put on a big D.B. Cooper festival because the FBI erroneously thought, based on the flight path, that he probably jumped in the Lake Merwin area, if you look at the map. Well, the problem is, as time went on and they started reviewing the air traffic control, and the Air Force got involved, and of course the airline, they think he probably jumped a lot further south. In fact, as farther south as probably the Vancouver, Washington area, which is nowhere near where they were moving. So at this point, we can assume that Cooper was on a beach in Mexico with a margarita. Okay, he was just gone. I mean, he literally existed for only 5 hours. So, time marched on, right? I mean, it was a big news story for a while, and people kind of forgot about it. Oh yeah, the guy jumped out of the plane, we never heard about it again. And then just when you think it was safe to turn on the TV, February 1980, a family was having a picnic at a little beach in Washington, near Vancouver, called Tina Bar. Of course, Tina was the name of the stewardess who spent the most time with him, but probably no connection, but you never know. And the little boy was building a campfire, and he started digging in the sand. And what did he find? He found 3 packets of money, $6,000. Now, people always ask me, well, $200,000 wasn't that much money. Oh, that's about $1.5 million in 2025. So it was a lot of money. So this little boy shows his dad, look what I found. Well, they kind of decided, what should they do? Well, they finally called the FBI. And of course, the FBI had all the serial numbers, which I forgot to mention earlier, but the FBI did distribute the serial numbers of the money to banks and casinos in the area, thinking one of these bills might show up. None of the money has ever shown up anywhere, except for the $6,000. Now, if you have some extra cash, every once in a while, one of these bills comes up for sale, because the FBI was nice enough to give the little boy who found it some of the money. Of course, he's now no longer a little boy, but he was able to auction off some bills, and people are still buying them. They go for quite a bit of money. So, years go on. One of my favorite suspect, tips that was called in. A lady called into the FBI and said, I was watching an old episode of Perry Mason, Raymond Burr this afternoon, and I think one of the extras in the TV show was Stevie Cooper. So they literally had to investigate. They had to figure out what episode was this. I mean, tons. I heard 1,000 men. I think that's probably too many, but how many men literally walked in to the Seattle FBI office and confessed? Even as recently as a couple of months ago, another guy showed up who said, I'm D.B. Cooper. I mean, it's amazing, like everybody wanted to be this guy, which is strange. Interestingly, in 1971, air piracy was a federal death penalty offense. Now, months later, the Supreme Court overturned the death penalty, but of course, Cooper wouldn't have known that was going to happen. And the statute of limitations was only 5 years, but they were so mad that they did not catch this guy that they actually did what they call a John Doe indictment, which means if D.B. Cooper's here today, he could be arrested and he actually could go on trial because it's in perpetuity that if they ever catch the guy, he can be tried and maybe convicted or maybe not. He'd be pretty old, but you know. So in 2016, the FBI said, we give up. We don't know who Cooper is. We've got other things to do. The case is, unless somebody shows up with some more of the money for his parachute, we're not going to investigate anymore. Well, coincidentally, a gentleman named Tom Colbert, who actually is Stephen Colbert's brother, he's a TV personality, journalist, and he sued the FBI because he said that he knew who D.B. Cooper was, and they were impeding his investigation by not releasing all of their files, which we understand there are over 80,000 pieces of paper related to this case. And he won the lawsuit. So, now of course they have to go, we're all seeing this in real time with the JFK documents that have been released. They have to go to every single page. They have to redact any names of people that are still alive, if it's something to do with national security. So basically they're releasing about 500 pages every month. Now if you're at all interested in putting yourself to sleep, just Google FBI Vault D.B. Cooper and you will come up with that tens of thousands of pages already have been released. And actually some of them are pretty fun to read, like some of the kooky suspects that people turned in that they had to investigate. So I'm hoping that you all are going to help me solve the case here today. So I've got some clues of who people think D.B. Cooper is, because since the FBI is not investigating, of course it was incumbent upon all of us in the private sector to decide. As I tell about myself, during the course of this case, I have segued from being Nancy Drew to being Miss Marvel. But we have a very large group of people, and some of them are very smart and have very interesting specialties that literally are trying to solve this case. So our first set of clues, a lot of people think D.B. Cooper, Dan Cooper, was Canadian. And why is that? Well, okay, kind of makes sense that you go to a foreign country that we had an order with, where you could maybe launder the money or kind of lay low until the FBI was not investigating anyone up in Canada. It's close by, right, to the Pacific Northwest. I didn't mention when Cooper asked for that $200,000, he asked for it in negotiable American currency. Now, please tell me what is negotiable American currency, and why would an American in the U.S. ever ask for it? Nobody's been able to figure that one out. So that, to me, is kind of an interesting clue that he might have been from another country, or at least be living in one at the time. The fun one that everybody loves is there was a series of comic books that came out in the 40s and 50s with a superhero skydiver named Dan Cooper. In fact, there's even one issue where he is jumping out of a plane with ransom money and a knapsack. Okay, but the kicker is they were only printed in French because they were distributed in France, Belgium, and of course we all know that in parts of Canada they speak French. So is that where Dan got the name? We don't know, but a lot of people think it's kind of an interesting clue. Okay, how many people do I have in the room who know how to fly a plane? Okay, I knew there'd be a lot of you. Okay. Was Dan Cooper a pilot? I've asked a lot of pilots that, and actually they've all said yes. We'll let you decide. Cooper used a lot of pilot lingo. He actually was kind of a nice guy. When they landed in Seattle, he asked for some crew meals. What are crew meals? Well, those are the meals that you serve the crew, right? That's not common terminology. He called it an interphone. That's the phone that the back of the plane talks to the cockpit. He told the stewardess to get back to her station. Of course, he used the term air stairs. He knew that he was offered oxygen. He said, oh, I already know where it is, don't worry. They were kind of stalling when they were in Seattle and said that they needed to get IFR clearance. And Cooper said, that's okay, we can pick it up in the air. Now, I have no idea what that means, or I didn't, but again, 1971, we don't have the internet. Did you go to the public library and learn all this? That seems kind of hard to believe. In fact, during the hijacking, the first officer actually radioed down to his group on the ground with Northwest and said, I think this time knows a little bit about airplanes. And of course, he knew about the 727. Who knew that the back stairs not all could be lowered in flight? That's a really inside bit of information. I did forget to mention the, hopefully nobody here is with Boeing, but they did investigate a lot of Boeing engineers, just because it kind of makes sense that they would know they designed the plane. Of course, came up with absolutely nothing. Okay, some other clues that Cooper might be a pilot is, let's go back and remember what he said about the flight configuration. I just asked a pilot this last night, do you ever fly with the flaps at 15? Absolutely not. That's for takeoff and landing. So Cooper knew that lowering the landing gear and flying with it and having the flaps at 15, that was going to make the plane fly slower and lower. He wanted the cabin depressurized, again, not common knowledge. Flying below 10,000 feet. Now, the one thing that sort of, you can argue the other side, is he did say that he didn't seem to know that they couldn't get to Mexico without refueling. So, if you want to argue both sides, this was Cooper pilot, that's probably the best one to say. Okay, was Cooper a skydiver? Now think about it, most crimes, even today, aren't they committed by young men? I mean, that's just the demographic, especially in 1971. Well, Cooper was pushing 50. Nowadays, Tom Cruise, he's like 64 going on 24, and 50 is the new 30, and all. It was not like that in 1971. So when you were 48 or 50, you were kind of an older man, right? So this was like such a wild thing. Did Cooper wake up that morning and say, I need some cash? I've never done it before, but I think I'll jump out of an airplane. No, this was at night. He didn't know where he was going to be necessarily, right? And if he had never done it before, remember he asked for 2 shoes. He knew what packing cards are. Does anybody know what packing cards are? They're just a little kind of looks almost the size of a credit card. It's stuck in the chute that kind of tells you what the serial number, who packed it, etc. He looked for those. He knew that the chutes did not weigh very much. He told the stewardess, don't worry, they're not very heavy. He knew he was very annoyed that he did not have D-rings to attach the front and back shoes. Again, this is really insider skydiver knowledge. He refused. They actually sent along instructions with the parachutes, which I think was funny, that the FBI thought, well, just in case he doesn't know what to do, we'll supply him with instructions. So he said, I don't need any instructions. He cut all that paracord, and according to a master parachute rigger that I know, he said that was really methodical. It looked like someone who probably had done that before. The FBI actually theorized after they brought in an expert skydiver that Cooper was probably a Class C jumper, which at the time meant someone who had done at least 150 jumps. Now this is where things get strange. Cooper had the choice of two back chutes. There was a 24-foot canopy NV6 Navy backpack 6 chute or a 26-foot canopy Pioneer 2 chute. He chose the smaller chute. Now, this is counterintuitive for a lot of skydivers, but typically you would, given the choice, you would choose the larger chute. We don't know why he did. Maybe he was used to jumping with a smaller one. Maybe he thought a smaller canopy would be less visible, but we have no idea. But that is what a lot of people use as their opposing argument to him not knowing about skydiving. Okay, this is one of my favorite topics. Does everybody know what AirVenture is? Anybody go see Captain Neil Hansen speak this week? Who was a pilot with AirVenture. AirVenture was a kind of an umbrella term for several CIA-owned and operated airlines, supposedly legit, but they were actually flying covertly. And at the time, of course, was the height of the Vietnam War, 1971. It was actually in 1968. One of the affiliates of AirVenture actually purchased 3 727s. One of them ended up crashing, I don't know the circumstances. One of them they decided to practice dropping men out of the back stairs at their base in Tak Lee, Thailand. This was, not widely known, obviously. In fact, it wasn't widely known that we were even operating, the CIA was operating over there. I think the plan was that there was some sort of skirmish on the border with Tibet and China, and they were going to be dropping American, were they military, paramilitary, CIA, I don't really know. But they were going to be, so they actually practiced dropping men out. Now, what does this have to do with D.B. Cooper? Well, guess what? The flight configurations were flaps at 15 degrees and the landing gear down with a depressurized cabin. So that has been at the forefront of a lot of conspiracy theories that D.B. Cooper either was somehow connected to Air America, he sat in a bar with somebody who was connected with it, but it was just too much of a coincidence that he asked for the exact same thing that they had practiced 3 years before. So Air America is a big topic of discussion in the Cooper world. Okay, well, I told you were going to help me solve the case, so this is how we're going to solve it. Okay. Somebody asked me before, well, what about that DNA found on the time? Now, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the History Channel, Netflix, Discovery Channel. They do D.B. Cooper shows all the time. There's a million podcasts. I know I've been on a few of them. And people think, yes, there are 3 DNA samples on the tie. Of course, in 1971, DNA was not a thing in law enforcement, obviously. But as time went on, and they were kind of getting pretty desperate that they weren't getting anywhere, they did do a DNA test. And they found 3 partial samples of male DNA. The problem is, they said they were so partial that literally thousands or even millions of men, like there's probably a lot of guys in this room who could be Dan Cooper if we were going to go by the DNA. So that turned out to be complete nothing. So again, time went on. They brought in a scientist about 15 years ago, and he took some swatches, he got some little stoves, we call them sticky stoves, and took samples from the top. Well, what's really interesting when they put them under the microscope, and in fact, as we speak, some of them are being retested by a world-renowned lab who deals in all this kind of stuff. There's some really weird things on that tie. Antimony, bismuth, titanium, uranium, things he used to make cathode ray tubes. I mean, just things that you would never, in one small stub, there were 100,000 different particles. There's weird bee pollen, and it's almost like he did this on purpose, just to throw everybody off. So what the Thai people are looking into is trying to connect where would you be working that you would be exposed to all of these elements. Remember, this was a clip-on tie, which usually were used by law enforcement or machinists in case you got your tie caught, you wouldn't strangle yourself. So it's more of a limited, I think pilots it's more of a limited group of men that would be wearing clip-on ties to start out with. And so a lot of people have pinpointed that Cooper worked in some sort of a research lab. And there have actually been a few investigators that have pinpointed it to one company in Pennsylvania. Now, I don't know. That's all I can say. It sounds good, but of course the FBI's theory on the tie is we don't know if he bought it with goodwill. So I give them credit. They're, like I said, they're retesting all these stuff. There's a lot of sand, industrial salt on the tie. So obviously whoever bought it was in some sort of research or manufacturing or something where, because I don't think anybody in this room has that stuff on their clothing. Now, the other evidence, which I have done a lot of work on, is the parachute that I mentioned that Cooper popped open and he cut out the paracord. Now, if you think about it, paracord is woven. He had to grip it and he had to cut it. So I came up with the brilliant idea that there might be some skin cells that could be embedded in the woven cords. I put together a team. We had really a world famous forensic genealogist, if anybody's following how they're solving all these cases like the Golden State Killer, where they do have your whole family tree and your 6th cousin that you didn't know you had. Turns out they're Dan Cooper, right? So we had a genealogist, we had a lab, all donated their services. We had an attorney who went to the FBI and he actually spoke with some pretty high-level people. They all put together a presentation, which we did. And it took several months, but we got a nice letter back from the head of the Seattle office of the FBI. He said, "We're sorry, this is evidence in a case, and you can't have it." We actually were going to do it on premises. This is how advanced this technology is. They literally could come in, and it's called an MVAC machine. They kind of spray, and then they suck up what's on it. So that's kind of where we are right now. I certainly haven't given it up. We have some other avenues. Of course, we have a whole, if we're around in November. We have a whole new group of people at the FBI than we had last year. So we're hoping that we can get some traction with getting this parachute tested. So that's the latest on what's going on in the case. I am open for questions. I'm going to put up. This is me. We have a huge Facebook group, over 5,400 people. It's called the D.B. Cooper Mystery Group on Facebook. Anybody can like it. You don't have to participate. Where we talk about all this stuff. I also have up here my email, or I'm on Twitter. If you have any questions, now, like I said, if you do know who D.B. Cooper is, don't raise your hand. See me after. Yeah. But does anybody have any questions?